Welcome to Dunamis, where people of faith meet the social and spiritual challenges of the day. Today, we are talking about evangelism, and my guest is Ryan Haines from the Gospel Training Ground. Ryan, welcome. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me today.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry and how it got started, and how you got started in evangelism?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ryan Haines. I'm a full-time missionary here in New York City. I work with an organization called Street Life Ministries, and we do a lot of street evangelism, homeless ministry, all around New York City. And I got started in that. I moved here to New York City 5 years ago after I graduated college to join the ministry. And then it was only recently that the Lord laid it on my heart to start the Gospel Training Ground, which is a YouTube channel, also a website and a Facebook page that's devoted to just helping provide resources to believers to learn how to engage the culture with the gospel. So there's a lot of stuff on apologetics, theology, evangelism tips, just basically things that I've learned over my 5 years of being a missionary, trying to share that with others who might have questions about how to do evangelism and things. So to back up and tell a little more of my story, how did I get started in evangelism and ultimately being in missions? I was an atheist before I became a Christian. I grew up in a Christian home. Didn't actually believe it though until I got saved when I was 19, and that's when I was born again. And so got gloriously saved, delivered from a bunch of stuff at that moment. But as I was beginning to grow in my walk with God, I remember for the first time I read the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew. And I remember reading through it, and I was just so impressed by all of the teachings. And I just remember having a very intense moment of prayer with the Lord after reading that. And just saying, Jesus, all of your ways are so awesome. Your wisdom is just incredible. I want to follow all of your teachings. I want to do everything you command me to do in your word. And then I paused for a second, and then I said, but I'm never going to be one of those weird people that goes out and tells people about Jesus.
I think I had that moment too.
Yeah. And so I think that when God heard me pray that prayer, he just looked at me, laughed, and said, I'm going to make this kid a missionary. And so after that, there was a series of many events that I believe the Lord orchestrated in my life that he used to kind of give me a burden for souls, a burden for missions, and ultimately a burden for his glory in the earth. And the first of those experiences was probably just a few weeks after that moment of prayer that I had. I was walking around on the streets in my college town, and it was late at night. I don't know what I was doing. I was just walking around, maybe praying or something. But I remember seeing a man down the street sitting on the curb, and something just looked wrong. Like it looked like something bad was going on or something. And so I just felt concerned for this man, and I didn't really know why. And so I walked over to him and just struck up a conversation. I was like, "Hey man, how you doing? What are you doing out here? It's late at night. Is everything okay?" Just checking in on him. And he starts to explain to me that he's a male prostitute and that he feels like he has no reason to live except to have sex with women and to do drugs. He just sees no point in life. And so as a young teenager, I'm only like 19 years old at this point, I'm sitting on the curb, sitting next to this man, and he's telling me all this stuff, and all I can remember is the hopelessness that was in that man's eyes. I just remember there was no life in him. Even though he was talking to me, he was just dead, like inside. I could see it in his eyes. And I remember he's telling me all about his life, and all I could think in that moment was, oh my gosh, I need to share the gospel with him, but I don't know how. And as he's talking to me, a car pulls up, and he tells me that that's his next customer. He jumps in the car, drives away, I never see him again. And I was just sitting there speechless after that. But all I can remember is I went back to my apartment that night with this burden that I need to know the gospel, and I need to tell it to other people. So that was the first thing that the Lord really used to give me a burden for evangelism and a burden for the lost. And after that, there was just a bunch of other stuff the Lord started doing, mainly showing me that, his kingdom is the only kingdom worth building, his name is the only name worth exalting, and just showing me that, man, giving myself to missions and to evangelism is one of the greatest things I can do in this life. So
let me ask you, what, for the sake of those out there who don't know what evangelism is, what is evangelism and how does it differ from missions, or is there a point where they converge?
Well, I think that missions is evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
In a very real way, that trying to do missions apart from evangelism is not missions,
Mm-hmm.
because missions is all about preaching the gospel, making disciples, and doing that in all nations.
But missions is more closely associated with going to other countries.
Okay, so in that sense, yes. So evangelism is not necessarily missions, but all missions contains evangelism.
Oh, okay.
Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, evangelism is essential to missions. If we're not doing evangelism in missions, then it's not biblical missions. But evangelism is simply bringing the gospel to people. You know, the word evangelism comes from the word evangel, which is the word for gospel. And so it's really just bringing the gospel to someone, telling them what the gospel is, and introducing them to Christ, who he is, and what he's done for us. So that's how I've always understood evangelism.
So what is the difference between, say, like for instance, I know that I have a problem talking to strangers. For me, I found that it's easier for me to just give a person money. It's usually someone who's down on their luck or homeless.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier for me to give them money and give them like a card from the church that I go to,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe a palm card that tells them, one of the shelters that they can go to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's easier for me to do, and then I'll pray with them sometimes. But it's difficult to talk to people, I find, for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And as you just expressed, like you had the problem when you,
Yeah.
So how do people train for that? How do people become accustomed to the process of it?
Yeah, good question. So a lot to say in response to some of what you just brought up.
Mm-hmm.
But the first thing I would say to address that last question is that the best training in evangelism is just doing evangelism.
Mm.
Just like with anything else, you get better at it the more you do it.
Mm-hmm.
So like you just got to practice it. And the only way to practice evangelism is to actually do evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I've grown in my ability to talk with strangers, my ability to talk with atheists, Muslims, Jews, people of different backgrounds, as I've done it more and more and more. So my biggest encouragement to anyone is that, hey, if you're a Christian, just go out and start sharing your faith, and you'll start learning as you do it.
Well, in your experience, you mentioned atheists and Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do to prepare for people who are difficult to evangelize to? I mean, I know that, with apologetics, you can
Mm-hmm.
train yourself. First of all, what is apologetics?
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us an example of what apologetics is, and how do you employ that in your evangelism to someone who's maybe an atheist or a Muslim?
The way I define apologetics, is my own personal definition, is the ability to basically defend what you believe. It's
Mm-hmm.
knowing what you believe, why you believe it, and why someone else should also believe it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I think of apologetics. And so when it comes to different subjects, there's a lot of different subjects in apologetics, but I think one thing that's very helpful is, first of all, making sure you know what you believe,
Mm-hmm.
right? Studying your own gospel, studying the scriptures, understanding the Christian worldview. That's
Preaching
very
to yourself,
important.
basically.
Yes,
yeah.
that's very, very important, to sit down and think through your beliefs and make sure that you understand them.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't understand them, you're not going to be able to present them in an effective way to another person. You need to see how all the aspects of your worldview kind of connect and go together. So it's very important for us to be well thought through in our
Mhm.
own beliefs. But then when it comes to other things, like if you're talking to an atheist, it's good to just look up some basic atheistic literature, look at some famous atheists on YouTube and watch some of their arguments, try to understand what their worldview is, and then compare it to the Christian worldview, see where inconsistencies might be, and then think about how it is you can help them to see inconsistencies in those in their worldview, and then try to present to them the consistency of the Christian worldview.
Mhm.
So when you're talking with someone in real life conversation, I've learned over the years that one of the best strategies in evangelism is to listen first. When you start talking with someone, you meet someone, there is like a whole lifetime that you're looking at in
Mhm.
that person, and you don't know anything about them when you first meet them.
Right.
And so I just like asking questions like, hey, what do you believe about God? Right? Like what's your worldview? What do you believe about how the universe got started? How do you decide what's right and wrong? How do you decide what's true? And just let them talk. And don't ask these questions in an accusatory tone,
Yeah.
but just out of genuine curiosity. What do you believe? How do you think about life? And then as they tell you more and more about what you believe, you're gaining information about them that will help you to share the gospel with them in a more effective way when it's your turn to talk.
I've noticed that people generally don't like street preachers because they're often
Mhm.
on the street screaming at people.
Mhm.
And I mean, even myself as a Christian, I find that very off-putting.
Mhm.
But I think it's challenging when you're asking questions. I think asking questions is a good way to get started
Yeah.
because it's challenging in that so many people, everybody is a different person. So many people have different perspectives and
Right.
views.
And that's why it's so important not to do what I call like cookie cutter evangelism, to just have like a formulaic thing you say to every person.
Yeah,
Because every person's different,
right.
right? So you need to get to know them as an individual, treat them as an individual, and share the gospel with them in an individual kind of way. You know,
Yeah.
now you might end up sharing the same truths with a lot of people, but you can package it different
Yeah.
for different people and depending on where they're coming from. So that's why it's very helpful to just get to know them first. Take the humble posture
Yeah.
of wanting to listen and learn from them and understand where they're coming from, and then guide them through the scriptures in a relevant way.
I found for myself it was the way that I learned
Mm-hmm.
was just by observing how Christ approached people.
Yeah.
He listened and he questioned people. And, you know, you look at his behavior as opposed to the behavior of the Pharisees,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very different. I mean, he treated sinners with respect.
Yeah.
So I think in that way, when you're speaking to an unbeliever, you're showing them respect by listening
Yep.
to their side of the story first, and you're not just dictating what you want to tell them. And then quite often in society now, people have a negative view of Christians because of, I think, primarily social networking and interaction on social networking and media, because you can read it, you can see it for yourself. And for myself, that's where I learned how to interact, or not to interact, by reading a lot of the interactions on
Yeah.
social media. And-
Facebook is not a good platform for.
well, it's
for
not a
debating
good
things
no, it's not a
sometimes,
good
yeah.
platform to engage with people, but it is a good platform to learn, and you can learn how to engage properly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think it's a platform that feeds
Mhm.
this, the trolls and the negative,
Yeah. Yeah, don't be a troll. You never
no,
want to be
no,
a
don't
troll.
be a troll.
Yeah. My number one rule for evangelism is never be a butthead. That's my number one rule.
What kind of negative responses have you had? Give me an example of like a negative experience that you've had that
Yeah.
really you learned a lesson from.
Yeah, so there's been negative experiences kind of in two different ways. There's been negative experiences where people have been negative towards me because they're offended by the gospel message. But I've also had negative experiences where I have treated people poorly in my evangelism. Like the things I regret the most in all of my evangelistic experiences are when I've not been gracious with people, when I've been a little too stern with someone, or when I've tried to shove something down their throat. In a way that was just not kind. Like, for example, I can think of probably one of the most heartbreaking experiences for me of a time when I did this was when we were out in front of the Flushing Library doing street evangelism. And there's a guy who comes by who lives on the streets all the time. And I've gotten to talk to him a number of times, and he never really is very interested in religious conversations. He's just kind of put off by it. And this time he came by, and I was just like, man, I really want to, like, I'm thinking in my head, like, I really want to have a conversation about the gospel with this guy. And so, I'm talking with him a little bit. It's not really going anywhere. It's just small talk. And so I started asking him about, have you ever gone to church? What do you believe about the Bible? That sort of thing. He was like, I don't really want to talk about it. I don't like talking about this stuff. But I made him talk about it. I kept bringing it up. I was like, no, let's talk about this sort of thing. And he just started getting frustrated with me. And I could tell by the end of the conversation, he was just irritated because I was making him have this conversation he did not want to have. And then after he left, at first I was thinking like, at least I got to share the gospel with him. I was kind of like proud about it.
Oh, yeah.
But then after he left, the Lord started convicting me, and I just started realizing like, man, I was being really proud right there. I was not being patient with him. I was not being humble. I was there with an agenda, and it showed. He was offended by that. He was irritated by that. And the beautiful thing is that he walked back into the library after that conversation to work on the computer or something, and I needed to go to the bathroom like maybe an hour later, and so I went into the library also, and I saw him there. And when I saw him, I knew I needed to go apologize to him. So I walked in, and I was just sat down next to him, and I was like, hey man, when we were out there, I was not being gracious with you. You said you didn't want to talk about this, and yet I forced the conversation upon you, and I just wanted to apologize because Jesus would not have done that to you. And when I said that, he almost started crying. Like that softened his heart so much, just for me to humble myself and apologize to him and tell him I was wrong.
Yeah.
Like that opened him up in a huge way, and he actually told me, he was like, that's one of the nicest things anyone's ever done to me. And
we see there's your testimony.
Right.
I mean, that's a testimony right there, because the Lord uses those situations to teach you and to teach him at the same time.
Yeah. But I think what I want to say with that is that when it comes to doing evangelism, especially out on the streets, every time it's a learning experience.
Yeah.
Even for me, I've only been doing this full-time 5 years, so I'm still learning a lot. But when we make mistakes, we need to own up to that, and we need to be able to humble ourselves and apologize, especially before unbelievers. Because when you were talking about earlier about the misconception people have about Christians, that we're just proud and we're just going to preach the gospel and yell at you or something, we need to do everything we can to offset that preconceived notion they have about us.
Right.
And we need to come with the utmost graciousness and respect and humility, not to compromise our gospel in any way, but to deliver it in such a way that we do not come off as haughty.
That's what I think a large part of the walk as a believer teaches us, because we have to be humbled. We're not the master of our destiny. It's Christ.
Right.
And he's the head and we're the body, and a lot of times when we behave in that manner, we're taking charge of the situation when we should be yielding to the Holy Spirit. And I find that for myself, it's hard to find the balance sometimes, because I come from a family that's naturally aggressive. So it's my human nature, or it's in my genes to try to want to not jam it down their throat, but just I'm overly boisterous naturally. But lately, I've only been attempting to evangelize in the last couple of years. And it's been humbling, because I noticed that in the similar situations, I've had to go back and apologize to people. And it's difficult to know where to draw the line, because so many, like I said before, so many people are different in their personalities.
Right.
And you have to know that person. I mean, if you're talking to a stranger, it's hard to know where they are. It's hard to know what that boundary is.
Yeah.
If you're talking to a friend, it's a little easier. And even with that, it's like, they have bad days. They have mood swings. So you're better off taking the humble approach and being the listener and sort of having a compassionate heart, as opposed to
trying to do evangelism without compassion just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Love for God and love for people has to be the motivation in evangelism. If it's anything else, it's evangelism in the flesh, and it's not going to go well.
Right. Right.
But just a few things to say with some of what you brought up. The first thing that I would say is that when it comes to street preaching, going back to some of the things you said earlier, I am not at all opposed to street preaching. I think street preaching is a biblical thing. I think it's a good thing, but I think it's something that's very difficult to do well. And I think there's few people who do it really well, because I think if you're going to be a street preacher, stand up and start proclaiming in front of an audience of strangers, you need to be a very gracious person. You need to be able to connect with them and relate with them, be a relatable person, and not just be rude and boisterous and that sort of thing. So I think it's a difficult thing, but I do believe in it. I think it's a good thing if people do it well. What you were talking about with the personalities, it's true that every Christian has a different personality. I'm more of an outgoing, bubbly, kind of friendly kind of guy. And so, talking with strangers isn't really, difficult for me. I can just do that more naturally, just interacting with people. It just comes naturally to me. But what I think of is how Paul told Timothy that what makes someone useful in God's hands is not personality, it's holiness. Right? So God is not limited to certain personalities in his ability to use someone. Right? What matters is that we're holy, that we're consecrated and separated unto God. That's the person he'll put his hand on, and they'll have an anointing to share the gospel in whatever way they find it easiest to do for themselves. So like I'm someone who can just walk up and just let's start talking about the gospel with somebody. I can do that very naturally. Other people are more reserved, and they might do it better in the context of a friendship or something
That's
like that.
me. Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
You know, as long as we are making the effort to share the gospel with the lost, that's what matters. And again, it's holiness that makes us effective. It's not personality.
Well, I think people also, they're expecting a negative approach from Christians just because of the way the media portrays Christians. And, you know, there's a large portion of the church that is very aggressive. I mean, what would you say to people who are, they say they're doing it for the Lord, but they're really coming off as being very pompous and very, you know, pharisaical?
Man, I don't think personally I've met someone like that, but I kind of know the people you're talking about. I've seen them on the internet and things and on videos. Man, I would probably just try to pull them aside and talk about their motivations. You know, I'd probably say, you know, hey, you're preaching good stuff. Like if the gospel you're preaching is true, say that, hey, you know, you're saying a lot of good things, but I feel like you're not doing it in a place of love. You know, so if I don't see love in someone when they're doing evangelism, I'm going to have some real issues with that.
Right.
And the thing is, you can share very hard truth and still do it in a loving way. You know, like I've seen preachers who, you know, are very intense as they preach, and yet I can see the love on their face.
Right.
That they care about the people they're preaching to. And yet they're talking about the reality of judgment and hell and these very stern things, but you can tell what's motivating them is a concern for the listener.
Right.
Right? So that's what I would try to get, is be like, man, you're sharing the right stuff, but I don't see love in your approach.
And that's
so
the
I
whole
would call
point.
them to examine their own heart.
That's the whole point, is it's about love, really. It's about sharing the love of God. And it's difficult for me to do that because I come from a family that was not expressing love very openly. And, you know, in the culture, I come from the South, which is normally, you would think the South is an open, warm culture, which it is to some degree. But there's also a tribalism. It's very protective. So for me, I understand where people are being approached on the street. They may feel, you know, they want to protect themselves from that sort of.
Yeah, and that's where I think like first impressions really matter. And that's why, again, I've learned that it goes a long way to begin by putting yourself in the posture of humility and listening to people first before you start presenting things.
Yeah. And humility and compassion, that's
they go hand in hand.
Well, that's the foundation for love, really.
Yeah.
And what would your approach be to someone who is, say, in the LGBT community?
Man, great one. So this is something that's true, I think, just in general, but especially in the LGBT community. I always say the number one thing is you need to lead with friendship. In Proverbs, I think it's chapter 27, verse 6, it says that wounds from a friend can be trusted. Think about that. Wounds from a friend can be trusted. Okay, now to tell someone, like let's take for example a transgender individual, to tell them that the identity they've embraced about themselves is false, that it's a lie, that's not who God created them to be, when they feel in their deepest sense of themselves that it is. That is a very heavy truth to give to someone, right? That is a wounding truth that hurts for them to hear that. But that proverb tells us that if we are friends, like they know I love them, I know they love me, we're in each other's lives, we're there for each other, you know, there's a consistency of relationship. If that's going on, there's a greater chance they're going to hear that truth from me if they know that I'm their friend.
Right.
You know, so I think leading with friendship is the most important thing, and you can show someone that friendship in a very, like, you can do it quickly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Just a simple smile and like genuine interest in the person shows a friendliness.
Yeah.
You know, and learning how to do that from the get-go, I think can take you a long way. You know?
Well, I think it also it involves identity. I think identity is a big issue with the LGBT community. I mean, with anybody. I mean, you know,
everyone's got
different religion. You know, we all. I mean, that's going to be another topic for another show, which I'd like to address.
That'd be great, yeah.
And if you know, if you'd like to join that, I'd certainly welcome to do that. But you know, I think identity is a big issue, and trying to explain how the identity of Christ is really the ideal for everyone, for all of us to identify with Christ ultimately, and to be sensitive to the other person's cultural backgrounds and whatever their influences are.
Yeah. And that, again,
that identity may be completely different. That identity may be totally foreign to what you're trying to convey to them through Christ. So it's a balancing act sometimes.
Yeah. So like what you just said about background is super important. Again, that's why I love to begin my questions when I talk with unbelievers. I love to begin with questions, just getting to know them. Because, like, for example, if I'm talking to someone who's Jewish, I am not going to use the word Trinity.
Oh, wow.
That will automatically turn them off. They won't want a thing to hear from me, especially if they're Orthodox. Same with a Muslim. I will not use the word Trinity unless they ask me if I believe it. But I can explain the Trinity without using the word Trinity, because when they hear that, they hear polytheism.
Oh, yeah.
They think I believe in more than one God, and that's not true.
You know, that involves study and apologetics, and I think that's a topic for another show, because we're running out of time, but I appreciate it. I appreciate your insight. I appreciate this conversation. We could pick it up another time if you'd like to talk about identity and, you know, all the other things that are involved in evangelism. I mean, we have a good foundation here, you know, and I appreciate you coming. And can you give us any advice as we go, and tell us again, where can people reach you?
So thegospeltrainingground.com is my website. It's got links to all the YouTube videos, also a bunch of other resources on apologetics, and just a variety of things regarding the Christian life, like prayer, devotionals, Bible studies. These are all books and resources that I've used that have blessed and benefited me. So I just make them available to the general public if they also want to find something on those different subjects as well. And then, of course, there's a YouTube channel called The Gospel Training Ground with all the teaching videos I have on there.
Yeah, we have it back here.
Then, perfect.
Oh, well, that's the
website. Yeah. And then also the Facebook page, The Gospel Training Ground. People can follow that and get regular updates and things that I write, videos I post, and things like that. So,
great. Well, we are running out of time, so I appreciate it again. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
and
no problem.
Thank you for joining us. And until next time, God bless you, and we'll see you again next time on